Hello and namaste. As always, friends, thank you for tuning in. Today is Friday, May 29th. It's 10:05 Pacific Standard Time, and it's Trash Day. In case you can hear the trash beeping in the background. I want to start today's episode with a moment of silence. A moment of silence, not just for George Floyd, or Breonna Taylor, or Ahmaud Arbery, or Tamir Rice, or Trayvon Martin, or Oscar Grant, or Eric Gardner, or Philando Castile, or Samuel Du Bois, or Sandra Bland, or Walter Scott, or Terrence Crutcher, but for everyone, Black, Asian, Latino, Hispanic, and yes, even white, who have fallen victim to the institutional use of police brutality words carry power with them and are therefore dangerous. And that's why we get manipulated into petty lines of division. It's a tragedy to me to see today people responding to the Black Lives Matter hashtag with argument, with contentiousness. I understand that many are motivated by the realization that there is an overt agenda, dare I say the word, agenda, an overt agenda to encourage and foster and propagate racial divisions. We cannot live with blinders on. Our world has long tolerated institutional hatred. We call it many things, including racism, but from the allegorical beginning of Cain and Abel, the true tragedy is that it does not matter what color a person's skin is. We are butchering ourselves. We are butchering each other, and that is in direct, violation of everything that we supposedly believe in and hold dear. At every level. I can lay that critique at this country, at other countries, this religion, that religion. We can find the same flaw in humanist and atheist mentalities. We dehumanize one another. And we leave a bloody list of names. The pain, the trauma, the grief is reawakened and refreshed and painfully relived by everyone involved every time we choose to butcher each other one way or another. Every time any given individual member of the human species seduces themselves into believing that ending another person's life will solve some problem. A lot of things can be said about what's going on right now, like I mentioned in the cover for the show, and I have to, acknowledge something that I think is important that should not get lost in the noise of whatever's coming next. And whatever critique can be given of this individual, which I'm sure plenty of critique can be. No one is perfection. We are all flawed. But I just want to honor the fact that today Governor Tim Waltz acknowledged the brutal and very bitter pill to swallow, and that's that the normal we all long to get back to was not working. COVID-19 has brought us all to new heightened sensibilities, probably on all levels. But nothing that we are being shown about ourselves during this time is new. Nothing that is being revealed about the iniquities and injustices and flaws, to put it gently, of our communities and our systems. None of it is new, friends. And that is nobody else's fault but our own as a species. We can point fingers, we can cite history, we can argue over evidence, but ultimately, we must contend with the spiritual calling that is the hidden truth behind our existence here, that we've so profoundly conditioned ourselves to ignore. I don't mean to belittle the notions of justice, the notions of accountability. Those things are true and right unto themselves if executed correctly, right? Yesterday I talked about the difference between two protests, and it saddens me to no end to have to then tune into the news and watch the way things unfolded last night. And while there's a healthy debate to be had always about free speech and its parameters, there are clear lines that I think we should not turn a blind eye to, right? The President of the United States does not have the free speech right to threaten citizens of the United States with punitive physical violence. That is not only not cool, yo. That is beyond the pale on so many levels. Equally so, and this is also something that is always difficult to bring up and discuss. It was unjust, it was inhumane, it was unfair for any of the names on that list. And there's larger versions of that list. Google the phrase, I don't want to spoon feed anybody anything, but do your own search on whatever search engine. for, the victims of police brutality, or a list of victims of police brutality. Visit such websites as mappingpoliceviolence.org or Wikipedia, for Christ's sake, has a page on this. And there's plenty of news outlets with featured articles about it from various years going back decades. I think I've commented before, and it's a frightening thing to have to say this with a straight face, but it's the truth, I think. People fear-mongering about how COVID-19 is being used as an excuse to bring about a police state are being led by the nose, and they're missing the point, right? That's the profound grotesqueness of the critique, like that we cannot go back to whatever normal we imagine, because that imagined normal was toxic as fuck on every level. That imagined normal, that period just before all of this got crazy, on all the levels that it's gotten crazy, was already fucking batshit crazy. And although it may not have been the visually oppressive, full-on onslaught of militarized police state lockdown that we fantasize about in our dystopian literature and media about at what levels it could get to, it was bad enough. There was a systemic, some might argue semi-unconscious, others would postulate, I think fairly and accurately, wholly spiritual corruption in our system of systems. And needless to say, law enforcement as a complex set of subsystems itself, what is law enforcement at a national level but a complex system of systems, of human organization? That being said, that critique being issued, it is my humble opinion that we collectively must take a moment and pause and take a deep breath and acknowledge and recognize that corruption exists everywhere. For what is the delineating factor between peaceful demonstrators genuinely wanting to speak truth to power without resorting to violence, and those who literally executed a strategic assault against the 13th precinct building there in Minneapolis and burned it to the ground? America has a really complex history of protest and riot. And any given pair of thoughtful individuals caught up in political paradigms can get lost down the slippery slope, meaningless argument of whose fault it is that when we as a people protest, it gets violent a certain percentage of the time. And to continue the comparing and contrasting, because it's important, I think, to always attempt to take a step back through the grief, through the anger, through the injustice, through the pain being felt for having witnessed the tragic and also seemingly almost redundant, in as much as that we are overwhelmed. You know, how many times does it take for law enforcement to brutally dehumanize an unarmed individual of ethnic difference from their own, for us as a society to address the deeper issue of the spiritual trauma that perpetuates such violence? How does any given individual get to that place, right? And this question falls on both, the police officers who have been responsible for such acts of violence, and those who walk amongst protesters expressing grief and wanting to be heard, and then turn to acts of destruction that have historically, often led to more violence and more conflict, either between those committing those secondary acts of rioting and, whatever police forces are called in to maintain control of the situation, and others. I mean, this ain't the first protest turned riot that we've lived through. And every time this happens, one has to ask, like, how many more? How many more events like this must we endure as a nation, as a community of various communities, as groups of people cohabitating in this toxic postmodern context, before we do something about it that truly makes lasting change, that truly has a lasting impact, that truly improves conditions for everyone. I'm a believer in prayer, despite having long questioned those who taught us how to pray and the methods they used. I'm a believer in what could be called authentic, organic prayer. And so I humbly invite those of you listening to pray for those lost to the violence perpetuated by police enforcement officers, to pray for those seduced by ego, which is the only way I can understand it, to transcend from peaceful, to descend, which is the more accurate word, from peaceful protest and airing out of grievances, which is what is defined and defended by the Constitution, right? If we're going to be all constitutionalists about it. Mind you, I've got a huge big red asterisk pin about the Constitution. Despite it being at the center of the American psyche, I don't really, I don't get it, why we don't question it more, and why don't we demand further change to it, and why we have made it sacrosanct to discuss editing it, keeping it a relevant document, why we treat it like a list of commandments in the Bible, as opposed to a well-informed living document of civic organization. But that's a whole nother episode. Now, I understand, man, it's easy for me as an onlooker in a different state entirely to sound like I'm passing judgment on others. And I beg anyone's forgiveness if I have ever sounded like I'm passing judgment on others. That's the last thing I'm here to do, right? That's the last thing on my mind. But there is such a thing as speaking the truth as I see it, right? And as I see it, from my perspective, given my worldview, as much as we cannot tolerate, as much as it is true and real and sane, in my opinion, to say that police brutality must be ended, as it's on the list of things we got to stop doing, as important as destroying our environment, right? It is also valid, I think, to say that we must exercise the kind of self-control that we expect from those in uniform, to not just brutally dehumanize us and use their position of made up and invented power to abuse us. We must not allow ourselves, while in active protest, to be seduced by the ego traps of riot and violence and looting and theft and fighting and committing acts of violence against one another. And trust me, in the heat of the moment, I can only imagine how impossible that is. As a human being, I myself have had life experiences that have brought me to places of deep anger. Real and justified, and sometimes not so real and not so justified. Others would argue entirely imagined. And I have been in places, for better or worse, where I have felt the direct temptation to act out my grief, my anger, my pain through my hands, through the act of beating some object into submission. And I've certainly hurt myself in choosing to take a swipe at the refrigerator. I learned a lesson that, violence pays back only violence, which renders pain. And I'm grateful for the fact that I have never struck another human being. And many would judge that as weakness. I have defended myself physically against others, and I have stood my ground, and I have wrestled others into a position of acknowledging that this fight can go no further. But I've never physically struck another person. And I don't say that to virtue signal, right? I mean, it's easy. Maybe I did. Maybe subconsciously I'm giving into that temptation. But my point is that we can all learn the lesson that violence begets more violence purely through the act of honest observation. We don't need to go out and be the embodiment of the Joker on the street wanting to burn Gotham City down to the ground. Horrible analogy, right? Or maybe also creepily fitting. And I don't know, man. I don't pretend to know the facts on the ground. I can only comment on what was shared, and I'm sure plenty was missed. I mean, this is a painful truth of all of this, whether it's an unarmed black man being shot by the cops or white people shooting each other with guns for whatever other reason in other contexts. We are miserably underinformed. And it tickles me pink. And I hate to come to a point of humor here, but I mean, let's make a different comparison, right? COVID-19, alarmism, and speculative conspiracy content arguing the death toll is false, either overblown and exaggerated or undercounted and minimized, have been circulating with vicious virality on social media. This is an unconfirmed thing. Are the numbers undercounting for lack of testing? Are the numbers being overcounted for corrupt and nefarious reasons? We don't know. The jury's out on that. Is it a possibility? Yeah, maybe. Are the deaths real, or are they totally radically fake and being staged? That to me sounds like a useless argument, right? People are dead, to the best of my understanding. Now, why am I rambling about that? Where's the outrage for the known fact, well reported and documented in various outlets? Just go to any of the gun violence tracking websites, and you'll come to a clear understanding that it is this massive elephant in the room. We don't track clearly enough, reasonably enough, diligently enough the facts on the ground, the statistical truths of how much we kill each other with guns. We just don't. Especially when it comes to law enforcement. Although, as is pointed out in a Wikipedia page I was on just a hot second ago, although where's the year? I want to get the year right. In 1994, and that was my senior year in high school, yo. I'm 44 years old. In 1994, Congress instructed the Attorney General to compile and publish annual statistics on police use of excessive force. I quote Wikipedia, this was never carried out. And for some inexplicable reason, the FBI does not collect this data either, or these data, because it's plural data. So we have estimates, and not even estimates made by agencies tasked with the job, but by, journalists, which we can then argue about the validity of their efforts and how much of it is corrupt by the corruption in that industry. We have a deep, deep-seated problem in this country, on this planet. And that's that we think it's cool to solve our problems through violence. We think that there's rationale valid enough. There's reasons motivational enough. And the problem is that's a slippery slope of bullshit. That is an ego trap. That is, dare I call it this, a kind of sin. Isn't it one? And I know there's the whole pseudo-intellectual debate about Old Testament versus New Testament. I don't even want to open that can of worms. I'm well informed. But I think Jesus might agree that killing people is wrong. And yet, we pride ourselves on killing as a solution. We indoctrinate ourselves through what we normalize in our entertainment, what we rationalize in our public discourse, what we tolerate in our own choices and in the events around us. And we have convinced ourselves, as of late, although it's not really new, it's just, we took a thing that was already horrible and toxic and took it to the next level, as the saying goes. That's some next level shit. That we believe a bullet to the head is a solution in any way, shape, or form to anything. Now, I get it. I understand the fear-based perspective of survivalist me versus the bad guy that's going to kill me. The problem is we've taken that sliver of truth that we have an impulse, we have a passion, and we have a drive to not die. Dare I call it a fear of death. And we have this addiction to, and that's controversial, I know, but dare I frame it that we can be addicted to good things as much as we can be addicted to bad things. And then, where do you land on deciding if being addicted to a good thing makes that good thing a bad thing? But we have this addiction to this nebulous and I think at times incoherent idea of freedom that what we don't talk about, right? When we adulate freedom, when we worship it, when we postulate that it is a fundamental right. And I'm not arguing against that, right? Like, don't misunderstand or misconstrue my words. I'm presenting the flaw, not saying that freedom should be taken away. I think that the flaw in our use of the term is similar to the limitation of the English language only having one word for the phenomena we call snow. The Inuit who lived in snow have, I think, hundreds of words for snow, because when you live in it truly and live with nature, right, and in terms of trying to understand it, not just to beat it into submission, right, but to comprehend it and to work with it, we reach a deeper understanding and require more words. I argue that there's a lot of things we've consolidated into really tiny little one-word bundles, and the doing so is in and of itself toxic because we limit our comprehension and therefore minimize things and create opportunity for ego to seduce us into slippery slope thinking. And here's where I'm going with that. We have this ongoing perpetual argument about freedom, right? And what it is to stand up to it being taken away. And we don't acknowledge that when you combine that notion of freedom and fighting for it, like it's an object that can be willfully removed from your possession, and we combine it with another powerful ideological construct, the idea of God-given rights, and we personalize them, you end up empowering individuals who are deeply traumatized, who are not rooted to their spiritual selves, and who are filled with pain. For where does anger come from? And we give them the tools to create a thought process that leads them to the conclusion that they have the God-given right to treat other human beings like objects and squash them if necessary, should it achieve some goal, coherent or incoherent. If we give in to that, what happens? Well, I humbly argue that a cursory glance over the last 5,000 years or so might give us a mind-numbing and bitter understanding that when we give into that, we just produce carnage that is perpetuated and never solves anything. For here we are in 2020, and Cain is still murdering Abel. Or was it Abel that murdered Cain? I forget. I forget because they are each other. There's a lot wrong, and there's a lot of detail that we can get caught up in. I earnestly and sincerely, humbly invite you to consider the idea, not so that you may believe in it because I said it, or because anybody else said it, but because I believe it's there to be experienced. And that's that all the greatest wisdom of the world, which must be disentangled from the corruption that has encroached upon it, which is difficult to do, leads us to an understanding that we are one another spiritually, esoterically, metaphysically, and that for how desperately real this visage, this sensation, this phenomena of believing we are separate, we are ultimately, literally also, simultaneously, one another in different shells, in different vessels, in different embodiments. And that comprehension of this is no trivial matter. We will never solve the problem of police brutality, of racial inequality, of fiscal, monetary, economic injustices and inequality. We will never solve these problems with the same tools and thinking that we use to create them. And I think that's dawning on us. I think that there is a slow wave of comprehension. And that is the ray of light and of hope. That more and more people are understanding deeply that the normal we miss wasn't that great of a normal to begin with, and that the problems we face are not new, but centuries in the making, generations upon generations. We cannot, for as much as the past is intangibly locked away from us, like we cannot touch it, it impacts us deeply. It lives within us esoterically. It works through us in subtle yet very tangible ways. And that if we continue to radically ignore that entire bandwidth of spectrum of the human phenomena, we will only keep forcing each other's faces into the meat grinder. We turn to violence because of suffering, and when we look hard, we ask the question, where does that suffering come from? It is from other violence suffered. And it goes back on for as long as we care to record history. And while anything that happened in prior generations is not any individual's tactical fault, it is our entire species' collective responsibility to step up and step into the spiritual healing work. For it is not an impossible magic that happens. It is an organic, visceral, real magic that requires effort, often intangible effort. the literal and metaphorical inverse opposite of burning the police precinct down to the ground. But it begins with our own internal choice to spend exponential growing amount of time turning inward, as counterintuitive as that may feel. It is not weakness to sit in silence if sitting in that silence brings you to an understanding of your own divinity and the divinity you share with the entirety of the human species. That is not some dogma to be blind faithed about. That is not some imagined artifice to argue over. It is an experience to be had. It is an experience to be had that is more urgent now, contextually, in pragmatic terms, than it has ever been. For even if we suddenly saw an end to COVID, which we won't, by the way, friends, not quite yet. Nature hasn't bitch-slapped us hard enough, apparently. Even if we saw the miraculous end to police brutality today, if from today onward, 0 unarmed people of any race or origin were ever mistreated ever again by law enforcement, we would still be sitting in a deeply toxic system that is so self-destructive that it drives us mad, that it traumatizes us spiritually to come to terms with the fact that everything we enjoy and think we love contributes to the physical and spiritual toxicity that is causing us pain. And so I beg you, dear friends and listeners, to take that time for yourself and meditate and pray and rediscover those organic truths that you don't need any dogma to find. And to experience the living teaching that I believe, although I don't have concrete proof of, was part of every enlightened master's teaching. And that is that if we look, we will see the truth that which we call God is the person in front of us. That which we call God is the natural order that we are destroying for profit. And that our ideas about that are often so toxic that they're self-destructive, and that we can set those ideas down and that we can heal. As always, friends, I thank you for tuning in and listening. This has been today's episode of Good Morning Trumptopia on this dark Friday morning. I hope you join me in taking a moment to sending peace, love, and grooviness to everyone impacted personally in and around the city of Minneapolis and everywhere else that protests are happening. Pray for the protesters, pray for the cops, and pray for the vandals and arsonists and looters, that may they all come to their senses and be touched by that which we call divine grace. And may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in all our hearts today.